wanted to get to know your story a little bit more and how you came about to be this amazing pastor that is so brave and willing to address difficult things.
Well, I never wanted to be a pastor growing up. This was a complete shock to me. I actually was an artist, a musician, and a visual artist, and then found myself in a church one day, and a woman said to me, John, I've been thinking about you and praying about you, and I think you would make an amazing youth leader. And I always say, I smiled and thought to myself, I know you're the current youth leader, that she was trying to get out of her job and she wanted someone else. And so I started volunteering and slowly found I had a heart for teenagers, and my faith began to grow because at the time I was basically what I call a hopeful agnostic. I had grown up in the Catholic Church, drifted from my faith, and then came back to faith and organized religion through this small little church and these teenagers. It's funny, I just met with one last week, and she's now 40 years old.
Wow.
And so I've known this group of students for that long, but the church got larger. I was given an opportunity to pastor in another church, ended up in a mega church setting in the South. And although I loved the work I was doing, I saw the inherent compromises in the church. I saw the institutional racism. I saw the misogyny, the homophobia, and I was resisting it in my heart. And yet I was in this position where I had to represent the church. So there was this kind of tension between the person I was becoming and the pastor that I was expected to be. And I started slowly speaking and writing more explicitly, knowing that I'm probably going to be, I could be an authentic pastor or an employed pastor. And so I ended up in the church where I happened to be, here in this city actually. That became true. They said I could not be a pastor and say the things I was saying because it did not fit with who they were. So I found myself outside of the church, outside of that work, and then I had to decide, did I even still want to be a pastor? Did I still want to even be part of the church at all? And if I was going to be, then what kind of minister did I want to be? What did I learn from all those years? And I decided I was going to ask anything and say everything. And I was going to be honest about what I believed the heart of God was and what the church wasn't doing or should be doing. And that's kind of how I found myself with this sort of very odd virtual congregation of thousands of people. So it's fantastic.
Yeah, people just looking for a good pastor like you that makes them feel accepted. And
yeah, I think the people who are part of my community of readers and followers, some of them are Christian or former Christian or Jewish or atheist or agnostic, but they all have a deep heart for humanity. And I think that's what transcends religion. It transcends political affiliation. If you really deeply care about people, your theology or your doctrine is irrelevant. And I always tell people the only thing that actually is how you treat people. That is your theology.
Yeah.
And so when we gather, we just want to make life easier for people. We want it to be more compassionate, more kind, more diverse than when we got here. And that's really why we do what we do.
Yeah. So is it like within Christianity, your church, or is it more of like...
I call myself a spiritual mutt at this point. So my tradition has been Christianity. But if the writing resonates with people, it really is irrelevant to me. So we have a network of people called Empathetic People. And so it's a congregation in a very loose sense, but I still fight with and for my faith tradition.
Yeah.
Because I've seen the beauty in it, and I've had these moments where my life was really transformed, but yet I see the toxicity and the damage. So I'm always trying to figure out, what do I do with this? What do I do with this Jesus and then this church that are often very different?
Yes.
So although my road has been Christianity, it's a place where I find myself with just everybody. If I were to speak here on an evening, there would be people who don't go to church. And I love that because we can, as even we've done today, is hopefully redeem something that is often fraught with pain.
Yeah. So many people, in my experience with Christianity, is good Christian. And do you think some people would hear that because you're not like steadfast, like God is everything, like even though you do feel that in your heart, but you're not like, I stick to this one thing. It's like this very regimented, strict thing I feel like you're expected to have with God if you're a Christian. So, like,
Yeah.
have you ever had any Christians like that have?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what time is it? I mean,
Yeah.
every day, because that's the response of most people who are intimidated by questions or doubts, or even just the idea that you could believe something a little differently. Whoever and whatever God is not threatened by that.
Yeah.
Only people who are not quite sure what they believe are. So the response of you're doing it wrong or you're going to hell or all these things, they're just defense mechanisms. They're people usually who don't really want to wrestle with, what do I actually believe?
Yeah.
And so the most dangerous thing that I do, the most offensive thing that I do, is ask questions and say, well, all right, you believe that hell exists. Tell me how that's compatible with the character of a God who is love, that you could suddenly be outside of that God's love.
Thank you. Yes.
You know, and so
yes, I have that question all the time.
you know, Jesus says to his followers in the Bible, they ask him about forgiveness, and he says, you have to forgive relentlessly. Every time you are asked, you need to forgive. And so the idea of God sending someone to hell is God saying, I'm not going to live to that standard. That means God is going to be exhausted by us and say, you're done.
Right.
That to me is not inherently loving.
Right.
So when you ask a question like that, people who have grown up in a place like this all of their lives, they've never really asked the follow-up questions. Well, for God to be love and hell to exist, how do I make sense of that? You know, the first thing we have to figure out if we believe in hell is, well, then who goes there? And how do they go there? And it's usually everyone goes there, but not me, of course. And it's got to be the other things that people do. So we often joke that many Christians' idea of sin is the bad stuff that I'm not doing. Which is why you see so many people condemning the LGBTQ community. You know, they might be divorced and Jesus condemns divorce, but they're okay with that because they want to have someone they can hold a barrier between them and God. So anyway, you just ask these questions, or even about prayer. You know, I talk about prayer a lot, and I used to pray for people to get well. And I still have that instinct, but the question is, when you pray for someone to get well, you probably had people say, if we could just get enough people praying, as if God is like a GoFundMe, that God's going, okay, you've got 5,000 people praying, but I'm not going to help this person who's sick until you can give me, I need to get like 10,000. And so what do we do with that? How do we understand our relationship to God and prayer and those things? So for me, prayer changed to, I'm going to ask God to change me in whatever circumstances I'm in so that I can be an agent of love. I'm not going to say, God, fix this, especially if I can fix it, if I can be a part of fixing it. So.
You were mentioning earlier you being a youth leader and how different that was from being a pastor at first, and what you were being told firsthand about people and what they were experiencing. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, you know, being a student pastor, I used to say to my senior pastor, you have it easy. You'll be in a building like this and it'll be full on Sunday morning and people are laughing at your jokes, or they're crying at something you're saying, or you see all their hands raised and the giving baskets are full. You can feel like everything in the church is good. But then you can be a student pastor and be with teenagers who are sharing the mess that's happening in the trenches of their lives, whether it's addiction issues or relational things or family stuff. And then you realize, right, and you realize how much damage, how much fracture is happening, and you realize how much you should be responding to it. And I remember having a senior pastor one time, I was telling him about all of our kids and what they were struggling with and how I was feeling overwhelmed. And he said, well, basically he wanted them to accept Jesus so that they could go to heaven later. So he cared more about what happened to them after this. But I was basically saying, but we're here with them now, and let's make their life actually less painful. And he said, John, it's not an exaggeration to say that I have no interest in ministering to people, because he saw the goal as getting people to heaven. But I see a Jesus who says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So Jesus is saying, let goodness happen here.
Yes.
Let equality, let compassion, let those things happen here. That's why Jesus fed people. That's why he healed people. If Jesus was just here to give people a free ticket to heaven, the Bible would have been really short.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus would have gone, pray this prayer and go to heaven. We'll see you.
Yeah.
But no, he lived alongside people, and he healed, and he spent time in the streets and with priests and with prostitute, with the religious elite and the street people.
Yeah. So obviously you've experienced firsthand young people experiencing abuse of power from within the church. And you've had stories told to you. You get emails and letters about that. And what is your stance on the way in which the church doesn't want to address those things?
Well, I think all organizations are wired to protect themselves. There's a self-preservation that happens when any sort of injury or abuse is exposed. The first response is, how can we make sure this is not about us and this is not about a failing in the system? And so the hardest part is when a young person is vulnerable enough to share that. That is a sacred thing. And so in my experience, it was always about saying, I'm going to make that pain the thing that motivates me, the idea of the one versus the 99. Jesus goes after the one. I think we need courageous ministers. We need people who are in church leadership to say, I'm going to be willing to get this messy because trauma is. And most churches want clean. They want, we've got a service planned, we're going to do these things, and that's what we're going to do. But real community and real relationship, like all real relationship, it's messy. And so we have to be willing to engage that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I almost think it would be more powerful and more compelling for a church as an organization if they came out and they were like, we denounce this. And this person within our church did that. We call them out and they're the ones that have to leave, not the young girls that literally a girl commented, she said she got kicked out of her church because she wore leggings. And they said it was too, sexual. And it's like, why are we kicking out those people? But then you hear about men within the church doing something to children and it's like they get protected. Like, why is that happening? And I think it could be so powerful if the church just admitted it and called out the wolves in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, and it's funny because Jesus basically says, hey, if you've got a problem, you should gouge your eye out because it's about you. It's about your heart. It's not about the person you're seeing.
Yeah.
And that's how we flipped it in our culture. We say, well, okay, it's got to be about the person or a woman or what she's wearing or how she acts or her dating history. And basically Jesus would say, no, actually it's about you and you need to fix you. And so I think that's some of the work that people raised in the church need to do.
Yeah, amazing. Well, on that note, I think that's pretty a profound note to end on. So.
Well, thanks again. So good to be with you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.